Welcome back, everyone. We are now going to go through two quick back-to-back demonstration lessons, putting these fundamentals into practice. This first demonstration is going to focus on the basic structure of a virtual network, in which we're going to focus specifically on the relationship between an address space and a subnet. Starting off in this demo, we're going to start off by creating an address space for our initial virtual network, and then inside of that, we are going to just create a single simple subnet. Now, this does sound relatively simple. However, we are going to focus on the relationship between the address space and the subnet, especially concerning what type of subnets we can create based on our address space. And then after we create our subnet, we're also going to do a little bit of a bonus in which we're going to configure IP version 6 in our virtual network as well by adding on an additional IPv6 address space in addition to the IP version 4. Keep in mind, this is not going to be a primary exam focus, but I think it is pretty good to know. With that, let's go ahead and jump over to our Azure Playgrounds and get started. Okay, back in our Azure environment, let's go ahead and get started. Before I jump into this initial demo, one quick item I want to point out is that for the majority of the demonstrations we're going to have in this course, you will also be able to follow along in the Azure Playgrounds if you have access to that feature. With that in mind, there will be a few demonstrations in this course you will not be able to follow along within the Azure Playgrounds, specifically demonstrations that require a separate dedicated resource group, or other ones that require more permanent resources or external sources, such as our upcoming discussion on DNS or public DNS here in a little bit. However, unless it is otherwise stated, you should be able to follow along with these demonstrations in the Azure Playground, and I certainly encourage you to do so. Moving on, in our Azure Playground, we are now going to go ahead and create our first virtual network in which we're going to focus on the address space setup. Easiest way to get there is from our top menu bar or our top search field. We'll just type in virtual network. Go ahead and select that, and we'll go ahead and click on Create Virtual Network. And for our first screen, we'll go ahead and put in the initial information, such as our existing resource group. And for now, we're just going to go ahead and give this virtual network a simple name called my-vnet. Moving on to the IP addresses field is where we are going to focus most of our time. By default, when you create a new virtual network, it'll automatically supply a new address space and a default subnet for you. These are actually in line with what we want to do for this demonstration. However, for demonstration's sake, let's go ahead and remove this address space and subnet and go ahead and create a new one focusing on the relationships. So let's do that by first cleaning up our existing address spaces. If we hit the little trash can here, it'll make our address space go away, and it will remove our subnet as well. While we're doing that, let me go ahead and zoom in here just a little bit. Let's now go ahead and create a new IP version for address space. When I click on this field, the only thing I can do is enter a new address space, and I'm going to actually go ahead and do the one I did previously, in which case I'm going to go ahead and input the same one that was there previously of 10.0.0/16. Also notice if you are not entering a valid private IP address or IP address range, you will get error messages telling you what you need to change. Next, let's go ahead and create a new subnet which will sit inside of this address space. I'll go ahead and click on Add Subnet. And in here is where I'm going to put in a few purposely incorrect values that do not fit inside the address range, just so we can see what kind of response we get back. Let's go ahead and name this subnet my-subnet. And next we need to put in an address range. Now this subnet address range must fit or be encompassed inside of our IP version 4 address space on the left side of 10.0.0/16. So for example, if we put in an invalid subnet address range, let's try 10.1.0.0/24. We will go ahead and get immediate feedback that that is not a valid subnet range because it is not contained in the virtual network's address space. However, if we change our 10.1.0.0 address to 10.0.0.0, that now shows as being correct because it does fit inside the address space, and we can go ahead and click on Add. So that's really all there is to it. I just wanted to focus on the relationship between creating an address space and creating a subnet range that exists inside of that address space. Keep in mind, you also have the option of adding multiple address spaces to a virtual network. Let's say, for example, if we added a 192 address, such as 192.168.0.0/16, we could also create a subnet that fits inside of the 192 address space, in addition to the 10.0 address space as well. Last thing I want to do before I wrap up, again, as a little bit of a bonus, is go ahead and add on an additional and optional IP version 6 address space. When I do so, I get a prompt at the bottom to go ahead and enter an IP version 6 address space here as well. Now, addressing for IP version 6 is a little bit more complicated than IP version 4, in which we're introducing hexadecimal format with a combination of letters and numbers. We're not going to dive too deeply into that. For the time being, though, we are just going to go ahead and choose the default option it provides us, which is a /48 CIDR notation range, and that will do fine for this demonstration. Last thing we will need to do is, now that we've created our IP version 6 address space, we need to assign an IP version 6 subnet to that IP version 6 address space as well. One method of doing so is going to our existing subnet that we created. I'll go ahead and click on My Subnet. Click the checkbox for Add IP version 6 address space, which would not have been available without an IP version 6 address space here as well, in which we can go ahead and submit an IP version 6 subnet range. And for demonstration's sake, to avoid getting too deep into the nuance of IP version 6, I have a subnet and an off-screen note I'll go ahead and copy and paste into here, which is this IP version 6 subnet range with a /64 CIDR notation that fits inside of our /48 IP version 6 address space in here. With that, everything else looks good. We're not getting any error messages, and we'll go ahead and click on Save. So at this point, we now have two address spaces, one of them IP version 4 and the other IP version 6, and we have a single subnet named My Subnet with a valid subnet range in both the IP version 4 and 6 formats that both fit inside of our IP version 4 and version 6 address space up here. Last step for this demonstration is to go ahead and create our virtual network. We'll go ahead and click on Review and Create. Then after a brief moment, we should get the go-ahead to go ahead and create it. And then our virtual network will create from there. At this point, this concludes our demonstration of creating our initial virtual network, focusing specifically on the relationship between address spaces and subnets. Let's now go ahead and move on to our next demonstration, in which we are going to build off this previous demonstration and focus on IP addressing within resources in our virtual network. If you are following along with these demonstrations on your end, I would actually encourage you to leave everything else up as is, because the next demonstration will build directly on top of our freshly created virtual network. With that, let's now go ahead and move on to our next demonstration, and I will see you then.